This. This is what we're here to talk about. This giant crack down through this wedge. But for the uninitiated, splitting wedges are firewood making tools used to split logs that are too big or knotty or otherwise tough to do with a regular axe or even a splitting maul. Now obviously this is a round that's only 2 inches thick, so you could probably throw this one at the ground hard enough to break it, but I offer this just for illustrative purposes. Assuming this log was 2 feet tall and tough, you just pick a crack, line it up, and start banging on it with a hammer. And eventually, if you play your cards right, busts apart and you've got firewood. Now, these wedges are almost always softer than the metal hammers you're striking them with. The hammers have hardened metal heads, and these wedges are softer, especially on the end that you strike them with. If they were the same hardness as the hammers, it would probably generate a lot more sparks and potentially cause some issues. Maybe even tiny pieces of metal shrapnel coming off of this and flying in various directions. But the fact that they are soft means that they tend to deform over time. As you strike them, you'll see that the metal, this is a terrible example because it's so beat to death, but here's a better example where you can see what I'm talking about. The metal actually curls over, mushrooms out, and then starts to wrap around and over the edge of the wedge. Now, when I was a kid, I always thought that looked pretty neat because I thought, man, you were doing some real manly work and using your tools. My grandfather always said you should address that by taking a file and grinding that edge off, grinding that lip off, or putting it on your bench grinder. The reason being is these chunks of metal will eventually break off when you're not expecting it and can come flying at your face or neck or other body parts that you may not want hot, jagged metal flying at. But the other problem with that is, and I never saw this, or maybe I saw it, but I never noticed it until now. As my grandfather said, if you don't address these cracks, occasionally you will get a crack that persists back into the center of the wedge itself. And as you keep hammering it, you will actually drive it down into the wedge, ruining your wedge. Now, I don't recall ever seeing that. I kind of, at the time, I took it as a sign that maybe my grandpa was an old, grumpy man set in his ways, and he just liked his tools maintained a certain way. I didn't really think that would happen, because we beat the crap out of my dad's wedges, and we never ever dressed up these edges. But recently, November, my father passed, and I was looking at one of his old wedges that we never dressed up. Lo and behold, we do see what you're talking about, where this thing rounded over, mushroomed out, and then pieces clearly broke off. And I do remember a couple times we broke pieces off and we thought it was funny. But what we see here is actually exactly what my grandfather warned us about. You can kind of see a tiny crack in the top here, and this piece of metal was hammered over in place, so it kind of it almost masks the flaw underneath it. But there's a huge crack that developed all the way down into the wedge. And on this other side, you see the same thing. There was a crack right about here that wasn't addressed, and we just kept hammering this and hammering this and hammering this. And now, lo and behold, we've got a crack that's probably, I would say that is a good inch down into the wedge itself. In fact, it looks like this whole face here is about to break off, essentially ruining the wedge. Now, I say that to say two things. Number one, I guess my grandpa was right. And number two, I don't know what to do with that wedge now. Because if I grind it all the way down to here, it's only going to be about 4 inches long. And I don't think that a 4-inch long wedge would be very useful for splitting firewood. But I would have to go pretty deep to get past all those flaws in that crack. I could maybe try to hit it with a wire wheel and weld it, but I don't know, is that safe? Would the weld hold up, or will I just buy myself some temporary time and then this will come apart in an even more dangerous situation, because that right there is a really large piece of metal, and if that was to come flying at everybody, anyone, that could be a real problem. I don't know. Maybe I'll just keep it as a paperweight.